Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of the training compound, her duffel bag heavy on her shoulder as she watched dozens of recruits rushing around like ants. The California sun beat down mercilessly on the concrete, making the air shimmer with heat. She had dreamed of this moment for years, but now that she was here, doubt crept into her mind like cold water seeping through a crack. The Naval Special Warfare Training Center sprawled before her like a small city dedicated to breaking people down and rebuilding them into something harder, something unbreakable. Obstacle courses stretched across sandy fields. Pools of murky water reflected the harsh sun, and everywhere she looked, instructors barked orders at sweating recruits who moved with desperate determination. Sarah adjusted the strap of her bag and walked toward the registration building. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her face calm. She had learned long ago not to show weakness, especially not in places like this where sharks could smell fear from miles away. The registration line moved slowly. Around her, men talked in low voices about their backgrounds, their preparation, their fears. Sarah listened without joining in. A few glanced at her curiously, but most ignored her completely. She was used to that too. Next, called a bored-looking petty officer behind a metal desk. Sarah stepped forward and handed over her paperwork. The man scanned it quickly, his eyebrows rising slightly when he saw her test scores and fitness ratings. Mitchell, Sarah, age 24, former Marine Corps. He looked up at her with new interest. What made you switch branches? Wanted a new challenge, Sarah replied simply. The petty officer stamped her papers and handed them back. Barracks 7, Bunk 12. Orientation starts at 0500 tomorrow. Don't be late. Sarah nodded and headed toward the barracks. The building was long and low, painted the same dull beige as military buildings everywhere. Inside, the familiar smell of disinfectant and worn canvas greeted her. Rows of metal bunks lined the walls, most already claimed by earlier arrivals. She found bunk 12 and set her bag down. The mattress was thin and hard, the pillow barely thicker than a book. Home sweet home for the next several months, if she was lucky enough to make it that long. You the new girl? Sarah turned to see a tall, lanky recruit with sandy hair approaching her. He had the easy confidence of someone who had never been told he couldn't do something. I'm Sarah, she said, extending her hand. Jake Patterson, from Texas. His grip was firm but not crushing. First time trying for special warfare? Yeah, you. Second time. Didn't make it through Hell Week last year. He said it without shame, which surprised her. Most people would have tried to hide that failure. What happened? Got pneumonia during surf torture. Medics pulled me out. Jake sat on the bunk across from hers. You know what you're getting into? Sarah had read everything she could find about SEAL training. The statistics were brutal. Out of every 100 people who started, maybe 20 would finish. The training was designed to push human beings past every limit they thought they had, then push them further. I know it won't be easy, she said. Jake laughed, but not meanly. Easy? Sister, Easy left the building about 10 miles back. This place is designed to make grown men cry and quit. Half these guys will be gone by the end of next week. More recruits filtered into the barracks throughout the afternoon. Sarah watched them, trying to guess who would last and who would fold under pressure. There were obvious athletes with muscles like steel cables and college boys who looked like they had never been dirty in their lives. Former Marines like herself and soldiers making the jump to Navy. A few looked like they might have been street fighters once, all scars and hard eyes. One thing they all had in common was the nervous energy that came before a big test. Some dealt with it by talking constantly, others by obsessively checking and rechecking their gear. Sarah dealt with it by staying quiet and observing. As evening approached, a loud whistle echoed through the barracks. Everyone snapped to attention as 3 instructors walked in. They moved with the fluid precision that came from years of training and combat experience. Listen up, tadpoles, the lead instructor bellowed. His name tape read Kowalski, and he looked like he could bench press a truck. I'm Senior Chief Kowalski. These are Petty Officers Martinez and Thompson. For the next 6 months, we own you. We own your time, your pain, your tears, and your dreams. Some of you think you know what you're getting into. You don't. He began pacing between the bunks like a caged predator. SEAL training isn't just about being strong or fast or tough. Plenty of strong people wash out. Plenty of tough guys ring the bell and go home to mommy. We're looking for something more. Something rare. Sarah felt his eyes sweep over her without pause. To him, she was just another recruit who would probably quit within days. Tomorrow you start the real work, Kowalski continued. PT starts at 0430. Chow at 0600. Then, we begin finding out who really wants to be here and who's just wasting our time. Anyone having second thoughts can leave now. No shame in it. This program isn't for everyone. Nobody moved. Good. Lights out at 2100. Sleep while you can. You won't be getting much in the weeks ahead. The instructors turned and left without another word. The barracks buzzed with quiet conversation after they were gone. Sarah lay on her thin mattress and stared at the ceiling, listening to the nervous chatter around her. Someone was snoring already. Someone else was doing push-ups beside his bunk. She thought about the path that had brought her here. Growing up in a small town in Ohio where the biggest excitement was the Friday night football game. Joining the Marines straight out of high school because she needed direction and purpose. For years of learning that she could push herself harder than she ever imagined. But even the Marines hadn't been enough. She had excelled at everything they threw at her. But part of her had always known she was capable of more. When she learned about the SEALs, about the impossible standards, and the legendary difficulty, something inside her had clicked into place. This was what she had been preparing for without knowing it. The lights went out at exactly 9 o'clock. The barracks settled into an uneasy quiet broken only by restless shifting and the occasional whispered conversation. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind was too active. She thought about her family back home. Her parents had been supportive but worried when she told them about her plans. Her little brother had been excited, asking if she would learn to be a ninja. Her sister had been more practical, asking what she would do if she didn't make it. Sarah had never seriously considered not making it. Failure wasn't part of her vocabulary. But lying here in the dark, surrounded by men who were probably stronger and faster than her, doubt began to creep in around the edges. At 4:30 in the morning, the lights blazed on and whistles shrieked through the air. Sarah was already awake, had been for 20 minutes, but she jerked upright anyway as instructors stormed through the barracks. Up and at 'em, ladies. Move, move, move. The next hour was a blur of organized chaos. Getting dressed, making bunks to impossible standards, rushing to formation in the pre-dawn darkness. Sarah's body moved automatically through the familiar routine of military life, but her mind was sharp and alert, taking in every detail. The physical training that followed was intense, but manageable. Running in formation along the beach as the sun rose over the Pacific. Calisthenics in the sand until her muscles burned. Swimming in the cold ocean waves that left everyone gasping and shivering. Sarah kept pace easily. Her years of Marine Corps training had prepared her well for this level of physical demand. She noticed the instructors watching everyone carefully, taking notes on clipboards, making mental calculations about who had potential and who was already struggling. After PT came Chow, then the first academic session. They were taught about the history of naval special warfare, about the mission and values of the SEAL teams, about the standards they would be expected to meet. Sarah absorbed it all like a sponge, but she could see other recruits already looking overwhelmed. The attrition rate for this program is approximately 80%, the instructor explained matter-of-factly. Most of you will not be here by Christmas. This is not meant to discourage you. This is meant to give you realistic expectations. He clicked to the next slide, which showed a bell mounted on a post. At any time, day or night, if you decide you've had enough, you can ring this bell 3 times. Your training will be over immediately. No questions asked, no judgment. You'll be transferred to the regular Navy and serve your commitment there. Sarah stared at the bell on the screen. Such a simple thing. 3 pulls on a rope, and all the pain would stop. It seemed both tempting and completely impossible. The days that followed blended into a rhythm of barely controlled chaos. Wake up before dawn, PT until their bodies screamed, academic sessions where they learned about weapons and tactics and navigation. Then, more PT, chow, equipment maintenance, and finally, collapse into exhausted sleep. Some recruits began to crack almost immediately. A college kid from California quit on day 3 after throwing up during a particularly brutal run. A former football player from Alabama rang the bell on day 5 when he couldn't complete the obstacle course in the required time. Sarah watched them go without comment. She felt bad for them as people, but she couldn't afford to let their failures affect her focus. Every day that passed was one day closer to her goal. The instructors were relentless, but fair. They pushed everyone equally hard, showed no favoritism, and seemed to have an endless capacity for creative ways to make simple tasks incredibly difficult. Sarah began to understand that the physical challenges were only part of it. They were testing mental toughness, the ability to keep thinking clearly when your body was screaming at you to quit. One morning during the second week, something changed. Sarah was coming back from the chow hall when she noticed a different instructor standing by the obstacle course. This one was smaller than the others, with short dark hair and an intensity that seemed to radiate from her like heat. "That's Commander Torres," Jake whispered as they passed. "She's a legend. First woman to complete SEAL training." Sarah tried not to stare, but she couldn't help stealing glances as they walked by. Commander Torres was watching the recruits with eyes that seemed to see everything. When those eyes met Sarah's for just a moment, Sarah felt like she was being evaluated at some deeper level than just physical capability. The encounter was brief, just a few seconds of eye contact, but something about it stuck with Sarah for the rest of the day. She had the strange feeling that she had been noticed in a way that went beyond the routine monitoring of recruit progress. That afternoon, during weapons training, Sarah found herself working at the station next to where Commander Torres was observing. She tried to focus on her rifle, on breathing and trigger control and sight alignment, but part of her attention kept drifting to the commander's presence. "Mitchell," one of the regular instructors called out. "Step up your pace. This isn't a leisurely afternoon at the gun club." Sarah nodded and increased her firing rate, but she felt heat rise in her cheeks. She hated making mistakes, especially where others could see them. Out of the corner of her eye, she thought she saw Commander Torres watching her, but when she glanced over, the commander was looking elsewhere. The training continued to intensify as the weeks passed. They learned to operate small boats in rough seas, rappel from helicopters, navigate by stars through trackless wilderness. Sarah excelled at most of it, but she could feel the constant pressure wearing on everyone. More recruits quit every week. Some left quietly, slipping away in the middle of the night. Others had dramatic breakdowns, screaming at instructors or breaking down in tears before ringing the bell. Sarah watched it all with a mixture of sympathy and cold calculation. Every person who quit meant one less competitor for the limited spots in the SEAL teams. But it also meant the loss of potential teammates. Sarah had begun to realize that individual excellence wasn't enough. The SEALs operated as units, depending on each other absolutely. When someone quit, it wasn't just their own dreams that died. It affected everyone who remained. Jake Patterson was still hanging in there, though Sarah could see the strain wearing on him. He had lost weight, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too little sleep and too much stress. But he hadn't given up, and Sarah found herself respecting his determination. "How you holding up?" she asked one evening as they cleaned their gear. "Day by day," Jake replied. "Sometimes minute by minute." "You." "Same." It was the truth. Even though Sarah was physically handling the training well, the mental pressure was enormous. Every day brought new challenges, new ways to fail, new reasons to doubt herself. The instructors seemed to have an endless bag of tricks for finding weaknesses and exploiting them. One night, Sarah woke to find someone crying quietly in a nearby bunk. She lay still and listened, feeling the recruit's pain like a physical weight in the dark air. Part of her wanted to offer comfort, but she knew that wasn't her job. Everyone here had to find their own way through the darkness. The next morning, that recruit was gone. His bunk was empty and stripped. His gear vanished as if he had never existed. The instructors said nothing about it, just carried on with the day's training as if nothing had happened. This was the reality of SEAL training. People disappeared. Dreams died. Only the strongest, the most determined, the most adaptable survived. Sarah was determined to be one of them, no matter what it cost her. As she stood in formation that morning, watching the sun rise over the Pacific for what felt like the 1,000th time, Sarah made herself a promise. She would not quit. She would not ring the bell. Whatever came next, she would find a way to endure it. She had no idea that her real test was still ahead, or that a small tattoo on her shoulder would soon change everything about how she was perceived by the one person whose opinion might matter most. The third week of training brought new horrors disguised as education. Sarah woke each morning with muscles that felt like they had been beaten with hammers, only to have the instructors find fresh ways to torture her body and mind. The obstacle courses grew more complex, the runs longer, the academic requirements more demanding. But she was still here, still standing when others had fallen by the wayside like broken machinery. Of the original 112 recruits who had started, only 68 remained. The barracks felt emptier each night, gaps between bunks marking the places where dreams had died. Sarah had learned to recognize the signs. First came the glazed look in someone's eyes during particularly brutal training sessions. Then, the small mistakes that cascaded into bigger failures. Finally, the quiet conversations with instructors that ended with someone walking slowly toward the brass bell that stood like a monument to human limitation. She had also learned not to get too attached to anyone. Jake Patterson was still hanging on, grimmer and thinner than when they started, but still meeting every challenge. A few others had emerged as potential long-term survivors. But Sarah had watched too many promising recruits disappear to trust that anyone would definitely make it. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Wake up at 4:30 to whistles and shouting. Stumble through the pre-dawn darkness to formation on the beach. Begin the daily ritual of pushing human endurance past its breaking point. But today was different in ways that Sarah didn't immediately recognize. Today, Commander Torres was present from the very beginning, standing slightly apart from the other instructors and watching everything with those sharp, evaluating eyes. Today we're doing something special, Senior Chief Kowalski announced as the recruits shivered in formation. Combat swim evaluation. You'll swim 2 miles in full gear, navigate an underwater obstacle course, then complete a weapons drill. This is not a race. This is a test of your ability to function under extreme stress. Sarah felt a familiar flutter of nervousness in her stomach, but it was the good kind. The kind that sharpened her focus rather than undermining it. Swimming had always been one of her strongest areas. In the Marines, she had consistently scored at the top of every aquatic training program. The recruits were issued wetsuits, masks, fins, and 20 pounds of additional gear to simulate combat load. Sarah suited up efficiently, running through mental checklists as she checked her equipment. Everything had to be perfect. In the water, a small equipment failure could mean the difference between success and drowning. Commander Torres approached as Sarah was adjusting her weight belt. Up close, the commander was smaller than she had seemed from a distance, but her presence was even more intense. Sarah could see old scars on her hands and forearms, proof that this woman had earned her position through blood and pain. First time with this much gear in the water? Commander Torres asked. No, ma'am. We did similar training in the Marines. Marines. There was something unreadable in the commander's voice. What made you decide to try for special warfare? Sarah had been asked this question dozens of times, but something about the way Commander Torres asked it made her pause. This wasn't routine questioning. This woman was genuinely curious about her answer. The Marines taught me that I could do more than I thought possible, Sarah said carefully. I wanted to find out how much more. Commander Torres nodded slowly, and Sarah caught something that might have been approval in her expression. We'll see. The water doesn't care about your intentions. The commander moved on to the next recruit, leaving Sarah with the strange feeling that she had just passed some kind of test she hadn't known she was taking. The swim itself was brutal. 2 miles in the Pacific Ocean with full gear, fighting currents that seemed designed to drag exhausted swimmers out to sea. Sarah settled into a steady rhythm, breathing bilaterally to manage the waves, keeping her stroke long and efficient to conserve energy. Around her, other recruits struggled with the water and the weight. She could hear gasping breaths and the occasional cry for help from safety swimmers. But Sarah felt strong in the water, more comfortable than she had in weeks of land-based torture. The underwater obstacle course was a maze of steel beams and rope nets anchored to the seafloor. Recruits had to navigate through it while holding their breath, simulating combat diving conditions. Sarah had always been good at holding her breath, but the gear and the exertion from the swim made everything harder. She dove down to the first obstacle, a series of steel hoops she had to swim through without touching the sides. The water was murky green, visibility limited to just a few feet. She had to feel her way through, trusting her hands and her sense of spatial awareness. Halfway through the course, her lungs began to burn. The voice in her head started whispering about the surface, about air, about the terrible possibility of drowning 20 feet below the waves. Sarah ignored it and kept swimming. She completed the course with her lungs screaming and her vision starting to tunnel. When she finally surfaced, gasping and coughing, she saw Commander Torres watching her from a small boat nearby. The commander made a note on her clipboard, but said nothing. The weapons drill was the final challenge. Exhausted recruits had to tread water while assembling and disassembling their rifles. Sarah's fingers were numb from the cold water, and her muscles shook from fatigue, but she forced them to work with mechanical precision. She finished the drill and swam to the beach, where instructors waited to evaluate her performance. Her time had been in the top 10%, and she had completed all requirements without assistance. More importantly, She had maintained her composure throughout the entire evolution. "Good work, Mitchell," Senior Chief Kowalski said as she emerged from the water. "Hit the showers and get some chow." Sarah nodded and started toward the changing area, but she noticed Commander Torres approaching. The commander fell into step beside her, and they walked in silence for several moments. "Your ex-Marine Corps," Commander Torres said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. For years active duty." "What was your MOS?" 0311, Rifleman. "Did a deployment to Afghanistan." Commander Torres nodded thoughtfully. "See any action?" Sarah hesitated. Her deployment had been mostly routine patrols and checkpoint duty, but there had been a few incidents. "Some contact, nothing major." "Combat changes you," the commander observed. "Either breaks you down or builds you up." "Which was it for you?" Sarah considered the question. Her time in Afghanistan had been difficult in ways that had nothing to do with enemy contact. The isolation, the constant vigilance, the knowledge that danger could appear without warning. But it had also taught her about herself, about her capacity for endurance and focus under pressure. "Built me up, I think," she said finally. They had reached the entrance to the women's changing area. Commander Torres stopped and turned to face Sarah directly. For a moment, those sharp eyes seemed to be looking right through her, evaluating something deeper than test scores or physical performance. "The gear you're wearing is issued equipment," the commander said unexpectedly. "But I noticed you have some personal items. A watch, a ring." Sarah touched her waterproof watch instinctively. It had been a gift from her squad in Afghanistan when she left the Marines. "Yes, ma'am." "Any tattoos?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She had 2 tattoos, both small, and both in places that were normally covered by clothing. One was the eagle, globe, and anchor of the Marines on her shoulder blade. The other was more personal. "A couple, ma'am." Commander Torres nodded slowly. "Get that shower. You did good work today." Sarah watched the commander walk away, puzzled by the strange conversation. Why would anyone care about tattoos? As far as she knew, there were no regulations about them as long as they weren't visible in dress uniform. She dismissed the encounter and headed into the showers. The hot water felt like a miracle after hours in the cold Pacific. Around her, other recruits were sharing their experiences from the morning, comparing times, and complaining about the difficulty. "That underwater course was insane," Jake Patterson said as he toweled off. "I thought I was going to drown for sure." "You made it through," Sarah pointed out. "That's what matters." "Barely. I heard 3 people got pulled by the safety swimmers." Jake shook his head. "This is only going to get worse, isn't it?" Sarah didn't answer, but they both knew the truth. The training would continue to escalate until only the most capable remained. What they had endured so far was just the beginning. After chow came an academic session on small unit tactics. Sarah tried to focus on the instructor's words, but part of her mind kept returning to her conversation with Commander Torres. There had been something almost personal about the questions, as if the commander was looking for specific information. The afternoon brought more physical training, this time focusing on teamwork and communication. Recruits were divided into boat crews and required to carry heavy rubber rafts through surf and sand while instructors shouted contradictory orders and created artificial chaos. Sarah found herself assigned to a crew with Jake Patterson and, for other recruits, she knew only by name. Working together, they had to carry the raft through obstacle courses, flip it repeatedly to simulate capsizing, and demonstrate rescue techniques in rough surf. It was during this training that the incident occurred. Sarah's crew was struggling to flip their raft back over after a simulated capsizing when one of the recruits, a former college wrestler named Davis, got his foot caught in a rope and went under. Without thinking, Sarah dove after him. The water was murky and chaotic, full of equipment and thrashing bodies. She found Davis quickly, his face mask askew and panic clear in his eyes. Sarah grabbed him and hauled him to the surface, where safety swimmers were already moving in to assist. I'm okay, Davis gasped as they reached shallow water. "Thanks, Mitchell." Sarah nodded and started to swim back to rejoin her crew, but she noticed Commander Torres standing knee-deep in the surf, watching the entire incident. Their eyes met for a moment, and Sarah saw something new in the commander's expression, something that might have been respect. The training day finally ended as the sun was setting over the Pacific. Sarah was exhausted in ways that went beyond physical fatigue, but she felt a deep satisfaction as well. She had met every challenge, completed every task, and even helped a fellow recruit in trouble. As she was heading back to the barracks, Commander Torres appeared at her side again. This time, The commander's manner was different, more direct. "Walk with me," Commander Torres said. They walked away from the main training areas toward a quieter section of the base. The evening air was cool and salt-scented, peaceful after the chaos of the day. Commander Torres seemed to be choosing her words carefully. "You did well today," the commander said finally. "The rescue was good, instinctive work." "Thank you, ma'am. But that's not why I wanted to talk to you." Commander Torres stopped walking and turned to face Sarah. "I did some checking on your background after our conversation this morning." Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness. Had she done something wrong? Made some error in her paperwork? "Your service record in the Marines is impressive," the commander continued. "But there were some gaps. Times when you were detached from your unit for special assignments." Sarah's heart began to race. Those assignments had been classified, and she had assumed they would remain buried in military bureaucracy. "I'm not sure what you mean, ma'am." Commander Torres smiled slightly, and for the first time, it was a warm expression. "Relax, Mitchell. I'm not interrogating you. But I know what those assignments were. I helped design some of them." Sarah stared at her in confusion. "Ma'am, female engagement teams," Commander Torres said quietly. "Special operations units tasked with interacting with local women in combat zones. You spent 6 months attached to a Navy SEAL team in Afghanistan, working in villages where male soldiers couldn't operate effectively." The memory came flooding back. Those had been some of the most dangerous and demanding months of Sarah's military career. Working with elite special operations teams, operating in hostile territory, conducting missions that never appeared in official reports. "How did you know?" Sarah asked. "Because I was the one who recommended you for the program." Commander Torres's smile widened. "I was a lieutenant commander then, working on developing new tactics for unconventional warfare. Your name came across my desk as a potential candidate. Outstanding fitness scores, combat experience, psychological stability, and one other factor." Sarah waited, her mind reeling from these revelations. "The tattoo on your left shoulder," Commander Torres said. "Not the Marine Corps one. The other one." Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to her shoulder, where beneath the fabric of her uniform was a small tattoo she had gotten years ago. It was a simple design, meaningful only to those who understood its significance. "I don't understand," Sarah said. Commander Torres stepped closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Show me." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then pulled down the neck of her uniform shirt just enough to reveal the edge of the tattoo. It was a small compass rose with an arrow pointing north, surrounded by words in a script so stylized it was almost impossible to read unless you knew what to look for. Commander Torres examined it closely, then nodded slowly. "I knew it. I recognized you the first day you arrived. But I had to be sure." "Ma'am, I'm still confused." "That tattoo," Commander Torres said, "marks you as someone who has been through selection for a program that officially doesn't exist. A program for female operatives capable of working in environments where traditional special operations forces can't go." Sarah felt the world shifting around her. The tattoo had been part of her graduation from that classified program, a mark of achievement that she had assumed only a few people in the world would ever recognize. "You're saying you know about the program?" "I know about it because I helped create it," Commander Torres replied. "And I've been waiting 3 years for you to show up here." The implications of this revelation crashed over Sarah like a wave. Her entire journey to SEAL training, everything she thought had been her own choice and determination, had been shaped by forces she never knew existed. "Why?" she asked. Commander Torres looked out toward the darkening ocean, her expression thoughtful. "Because the nature of warfare is changing. Because there are missions that require capabilities we don't currently have. And because I believe you might be exactly what we've been looking for." They stood in silence for several minutes, watching the last light fade from the western sky. Sarah's mind was racing, trying to process everything she had learned. Her past, her present, and her future suddenly looked completely different. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "Now you continue training like every other recruit," Commander Torres said. "But know that you're being evaluated for more than just standard SEAL qualifications. There are people watching your progress very carefully." "What kind of people?" Commander Torres smiled again, but this time it was enigmatic rather than warm. "The kind of people who plan for missions that haven't been imagined yet." As they walked back toward the barracks, Sarah felt as if she was seeing everything with new eyes. The base, the training, her fellow recruits, all of it was part of a larger picture that she was only beginning to understand. "One more thing," Commander Torres said as they reached the barracks. "Don't mention our conversation to anyone, not even your bunkmate Patterson." Sarah nodded, though her mind was still spinning with questions. And Mitchell? Commander Torres paused at the entrance. Keep doing what you're doing. You're exactly where you need to be. Sarah watched the commander disappear into the darkness, then slowly climbed the steps to the barracks. Around her, recruits were settling into their evening routines, unaware that one of their number had just learned that her entire life had been shaped by forces beyond her understanding. She lay on her narrow bunk and stared at the ceiling, her hand unconsciously touching the tattoo that had revealed so much. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests, new opportunities to fail or succeed. But now she knew that someone was watching, someone who saw potential in her that she was only beginning to recognize in herself. The question that kept her awake long into the night was simple but profound. What exactly was she being prepared for? The fourth week of training brought with it a change in the air that every recruit could feel. The instructors moved differently, spoke in shorter sentences, and watched the remaining candidates with the intensity of predators selecting prey. Sarah had learned to read the subtle signs of military life, and everything pointed to the same conclusion. Something big was coming. That something had a name that struck fear into the heart of anyone who had researched SEAL training. Hell Week. 5.5 days of continuous training with a maximum of 4 hours of sleep total. It was the crucible that separated those who merely wanted to be SEALs from those who would die before quitting. Of the original 112 recruits, only 42 remained. Sarah looked around the barracks each morning and saw faces that had been carved down to their essential elements by weeks of relentless pressure. Jake Patterson had lost 30 pounds and looked like a scarecrow, but his eyes still held determination. Others showed the telltale signs of impending breakdown. The 1,000-yard stare, the slight tremor in their hands, the way they talked to themselves during quiet moments. Sarah felt the weight of Commander Torres's revelation pressing on her like a physical thing. Every day since their conversation, she had caught glimpses of the commander watching her from a distance. Not obviously, but Sarah had developed a sixth sense for being observed. The knowledge that her performance was being evaluated for purposes beyond normal SEAL training added another layer of pressure to an already impossible situation. But it also gave her strength. Someone believed she was capable of more than she had imagined. Someone had been planning for her arrival here before she even knew this path existed. That knowledge burned in her chest like a small flame that no amount of physical misery could extinguish. The night before Hell Week officially began, Senior Chief Kowalski gathered the remaining recruits for a final briefing. They sat on benches in a concrete amphitheater that had witnessed the hopes and dreams of thousands of aspiring SEALs over the decades. Tomorrow, your real training begins, Kowalski said without preamble. Everything you've done up to this point has been preparation for the next 5.5 days. Some of you think you know what to expect. You don't. He gestured to a chart behind him showing the schedule for Hell Week. Even reading it was exhausting. Continuous physical training, obstacle courses, long runs in soft sand, surf torture, boat races, and endless hours of carrying heavy rubber rafts above their heads while instructors screamed criticism and created artificial emergencies. The purpose of Hell Week isn't to break you, Kowalski continued. It's to show you what you're capable of when you think you have nothing left. It's to teach you that the human body can endure far more than the human mind believes possible. Sarah listened with growing excitement rather than fear. This was what she had come for. This was the test that would prove whether she belonged among the elite few who earned a SEAL Trident. Many of you will quit during the next week, the senior chief said bluntly. Statistically, half of you will ring the bell before Sunday morning. This isn't a failure of character. This program isn't designed for normal human beings. It's designed for a very specific type of person, and most people aren't that type. He paused and looked directly at Sarah for a moment. She felt the weight of his gaze and sat straighter, meeting his eyes without flinching. But for those of you who make it through, Kowalski continued, you'll discover something about yourselves that will change how you see the world forever. You'll learn that limits are mostly illusions. You'll learn that when everything seems impossible, that's when you're just getting started. The briefing ended with technical details about gear, safety procedures, and medical protocols. But Sarah barely heard any of it. Her mind was already in the zone, that place of absolute focus where nothing existed except the task at hand. Hell Week began at sunset on Sunday with a coordinated assault of noise, smoke, and chaos designed to simulate combat conditions. Sarah was lying on her bunk when the lights went out, and the barracks exploded into sound and fury. Instructors burst through the doors wearing night vision goggles, and carrying blank-firing weapons. Smoke grenades filled the air with thick gray clouds that burned her eyes and throat. This is not a drill. This is not a drill. Everyone outside now. Sarah rolled off her bunk and hit the floor running. Around her, recruits stumbled through the chaos, disoriented and already behind schedule. She followed the flow of bodies toward the exit, her heart hammering but her mind clear and focused. Outside, the instructors had set up a scene from a war movie. Strobe lights flashed, sirens wailed, and speakers blasted the sound of explosions and gunfire. The recruits were herded into formation while instructors screamed orders that were impossible to hear over the din. Welcome to Hell Week. Kowalski's voice somehow cut through the noise. For the next 5.5 days, you belong to us completely. Sleep is a luxury you haven't earned. Comfort is a word that no longer exists in your vocabulary. The first evolution was called surf torture, and it lived up to its name. The recruits were ordered to link arms and sit in the frigid Pacific surf while waves crashed over them continuously. The water was so cold it felt like needles piercing every inch of exposed skin. Sarah gritted her teeth and focused on breathing as wave after wave soaked her to the bone. The instructors walked back and forth in front of them, offering escape. Anyone who's had enough can ring the bell right now. Hot coffee, warm blankets, and a hot meal are waiting. All you have to do is quit. Sarah could feel the man next to her shivering violently. On her other side, Jake Patterson was muttering something under his breath that might have been a prayer. Around them, the ocean continued its relentless assault, each wave colder than the last. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, they were ordered out of the water and immediately sent on a 4-mile run in their soaking clothes. Sarah's boots squelched with every step, and her waterlogged gear felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. But she settled into her stride and focused on the rhythm of breathing and movement. During the run, 3 recruits fell out and walked slowly toward the bell that waited at the end of the course like a brass monument to human limitation. Sarah watched them go without emotion. She felt bad for them as individuals, but their failure only meant that she was 3 spots closer to her goal. The run was followed by boat races in the surf. Teams of 6 recruits had to carry heavy rubber rafts into the ocean, navigate around buoys, and race back to shore. The boats were designed to be as difficult to handle as possible, and the instructors seemed to delight in creating additional obstacles. Sarah's team worked together with grim efficiency. They had learned to communicate with hand signals and brief, sharp commands. When their boat flipped in heavy surf, they righted it and continued without panic. When one teammate cramped up and couldn't pull his weight, the others compensated without complaint. But not every team was so fortunate. Sarah watched one boat crew fall apart completely when their leader had an emotional breakdown in the middle of a race. 2 of them quit on the spot, leaving the remaining 4 to struggle alone against impossible odds. The night passed in a blur of continuous challenges. Obstacle courses run in complete darkness. Endless sets of push-ups and sit-ups in the sand. Medical checks where corpsmen evaluated each recruit for signs of hypothermia or injury serious enough to force withdrawal. Sarah lost track of time entirely. The instructors had taken their watches, and the constantly changing exercises made it impossible to gauge how long any individual torture session lasted. She existed in an eternal present where nothing mattered except the immediate task at hand. Dawn came gray and cold, revealing recruits who looked like refugees from a war zone. Their uniforms were shredded, their faces gaunt with exhaustion, their eyes red-rimmed from salt water and lack of sleep. 7 more had quit during the night, slipping away to ring the bell when the darkness made their despair too heavy to carry. Day 1 is complete, Kowalski announced cheerfully. Only 4.5 days to go. The breakfast that followed was the first food they had been offered in 12 hours, but Sarah could barely taste it. Her body was running on reserves she didn't know she possessed, operating in a mode that was part survival instinct and part stubborn refusal to acknowledge the possibility of defeat. Day 2 brought new forms of misery. Long runs in soft sand that made every step feel like quicksand. Boat carries where teams had to hold rubber rafts above their heads while running obstacle courses. Surf passage after surf passage until Sarah felt like she was made of salt water and seaweed. The medical checks became more frequent as recruits began to show serious signs of stress. Sarah watched a tough kid from Detroit get pulled by the corpsman when his body temperature dropped too low to continue safely. He fought the decision, begging to continue, But the medical staff was unmovable. Safety trumped desire, no matter how strong. It was during the second day that Sarah began to notice something strange happening to her perception. The boundaries between herself and her environment started to blur. She was still performing at a high level, still meeting every challenge, but part of her consciousness seemed to be floating somewhere above her body, watching the proceedings with detached curiosity. She recognized the feeling from her deployment in Afghanistan, from long patrols where exhaustion and adrenaline combined to create an altered state of awareness. Her body was operating on autopilot, drawing on training and instinct while her mind retreated to a place where pain and fatigue were distant sensations that belonged to someone else. This dissociation was dangerous if it went too far, but Sarah had learned to manage it. She used it as a tool, letting her conscious mind rest while her body continued to function. It was a skill that few people possessed, and even fewer could control deliberately. The second night was worse than the first. The instructors seemed to have an infinite capacity for creative torture, and they used every minute of darkness to test the limits of human endurance. Sarah found herself carrying a telephone pole with 5 other recruits, running through an obstacle course that seemed designed by someone with a deep understanding of how to inflict maximum misery without causing permanent injury. More recruits quit during the darkness. Sarah lost count of how many times she heard the brass bell ringing in the distance, each toll marking another dream that had died in the cold Pacific air. By the third morning, only 28 recruits remained from the original 42 who had started Hell Week. Day 3 brought Sarah to a new level of understanding about the nature of human endurance. Her body had moved beyond simple fatigue into a realm where every cell seemed to be operating on willpower alone. Her muscles felt like they were made of lead. Her bones ached with cold that reached into the marrow, and her skin was raw from constant exposure to salt water. The constant barrage of challenges had stripped away everything non-essential, leaving only the core of her identity. She was Sarah Mitchell. She was a warrior. She would not quit. It was during a particularly brutal surf passage on day 3 that Sarah noticed Commander Torres watching from a distance. The commander was standing on a bluff overlooking the beach, too far away for Sarah to see her expression, but close enough to observe everything that was happening. The knowledge that she was being watched gave Sarah a surge of energy. This was her chance to prove herself worthy of whatever mysterious mission the commander had in mind. She pushed harder, moved faster, and helped her teammates with reserves of strength that she pulled from some deep well of determination. The surf passage required teams to paddle their boats through heavy waves, navigate around a series of buoys, and return to shore within a specified time limit. Sarah's team was struggling, their boat heavy with water and their paddling increasingly uncoordinated as exhaustion took its toll. "We're not going to make it," gasped one of her teammates, a former college athlete who had been one of the strongest recruits at the beginning of training. "Yes, we are," Sarah replied firmly. "Switch positions with me. I'll take the steering paddle." What happened next became part of Hell Week legend. Sarah somehow managed to rally her team, coordinating their efforts and finding lines through the waves that seemed impossible. They not only completed the course within the time limit, but did so with a performance that drew grudging nods of approval from the instructors. More importantly, Sarah felt Commander Torres's attention like a physical presence. She couldn't see the commander's face from her position in the boat, but she knew that every movement was being evaluated and recorded. Day 4 broke what remained of many recruit spirits. The sleep deprivation had reached levels where hallucinations were common. Sarah watched teammates have conversations with people who weren't there, saw them react to sounds and sights that existed only in their exhausted minds. But she also saw something beautiful, the way human beings could support each other when everything seemed hopeless. Stronger recruits helped weaker ones. Teams reorganized spontaneously to compensate for members who were struggling. The shared suffering created bonds that would last a lifetime. Jake Patterson was still hanging on, though he looked like a walking skeleton. During a brief rest period, he collapsed next to Sarah in the sand. "How are we still doing this?" he asked weakly. "1 minute at a time," Sarah replied. It had become her mantra, the phrase that got her through each new impossibility. "I keep thinking about quitting," Jake admitted. "Every time I see that bell, part of me wants to just walk over and end this." "But you don't," Sarah pointed out. "No, I don't." Jake managed a weak smile. "I guess that makes us crazy." "Probably." They were given 30 seconds to rest, then ordered back into the surf for another torture session. Sarah hauled herself to her feet and helped Jake up, and Together they walked back into the ocean that had become both their enemy and their teacher. The fourth night was a blur of continuous motion. Boat races, runs, obstacle courses, medical checks, and always the background chorus of instructors creating chaos and confusion. Sarah's world had narrowed to a tunnel of immediate experience. Past and future ceased to exist. There was only the endless present moment of putting one foot in front of the other. It was during this night that she experienced what she would later recognize as a breakthrough moment. They were carrying boats over their heads through a series of sand dunes when Sarah suddenly felt a profound shift in her consciousness. The weight of the boat disappeared. The burning in her muscles faded. The exhaustion that had been building for 4 days transformed into something else entirely. She was no longer fighting against the training. She had become part of it. Her body moved with mechanical precision while her mind floated in a place of perfect calm. She understood, suddenly, and completely, what the instructors meant when they talked about finding out what you were really capable of. This was the place where elite warriors were born. This was the crucible that burned away everything weak and false, leaving only the irreducible core of human potential. Sarah felt herself changing on a fundamental level, becoming something harder and more capable than she had ever imagined possible. Dawn of the fifth day revealed a group of recruits who bore little resemblance to the young men and woman who had started the week. They moved like sleepwalkers, their faces gaunt, and their eyes holding depths that hadn't been there before. Only 21 remained. But there was something else in their movements now, something that hadn't been there at the beginning. They moved as a unit, anticipating each other's needs, communicating without words. They had been forged by shared suffering into something more than the sum of their individual parts. One more day, Senior Chief Kowalski announced. One more day to prove you belong here. Sarah looked around at her remaining teammates and felt a fierce pride. These people had endured the unendurable. They had pushed past every limit their minds had set for their bodies. They had discovered that they were capable of miracles. But she also knew that the final day would be the hardest. The instructors would save their most difficult challenges for last, testing whether the recruits had enough left to finish what they had started. As the sun climbed higher over the Pacific, Sarah touched the tattoo hidden beneath her salt-stained uniform and made herself a promise. She had come too far and sacrificed too much to quit now. Whatever the final day brought, she would meet it with everything she had left. And then, maybe, she would finally learn what Commander Torres had been preparing her for all along. The last day of Hell Week arrived with a deceptive calm that made Sarah's exhausted senses scream warnings. After 5 days of continuous chaos, the relative quiet felt wrong, like the stillness before a hurricane. 21 recruits remained from the original 112, and every one of them looked like they had been through a war. Sarah's reflection in a bathroom mirror that morning showed a stranger's face. Her cheeks were hollow, her eyes sunken deep in dark circles that looked like bruises. Salt and sand had turned her hair into something resembling seaweed, and her lips were cracked and bleeding from constant exposure to wind and salt water. But underneath the physical devastation, something else looked back at her, something harder and more determined than anything she had seen in that mirror before. The final day's schedule was posted on the bulletin board like a death warrant. Beach runs, surf torture, obstacle courses, and something ominously labeled Final Evolution that was scheduled to last from sunset until dawn. Sarah studied the list with the detached interest of someone planning a funeral. Her body felt like it was held together with willpower and medical tape, but her mind was crystalline clear. "Looks like they're saving the worst for last," Jake Patterson said as he joined her at the bulletin board. He had somehow survived to this point, though Sarah wasn't sure how. He looked like a scarecrow that had been left in a field during a particularly bad storm. "Good," Sarah replied, and she meant it. "I want to know I've been tested completely." Jake gave her a look that was part admiration and part concern. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" Sarah considered the question seriously. Enjoying wasn't quite the right word. What she felt was more like completion, as if everything she had done in her life up to this point had been preparation for these few days. The Marine Corps, the classified missions, even her childhood in small-town Ohio had all been steps on a path that led to this moment. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said finally. The morning began with a 10-mile run in soft sand, carrying full gear. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a challenging workout. After 5 days of Hell Week, it felt like climbing Mount Everest. Sarah settled into a mechanical rhythm, her body operating on autopilot while her mind retreated to that floating place of observation. She watched herself run as if from a distance, noting with clinical interest the way her legs continued to move despite having no apparent strength left. Her breathing was controlled, her pace steady, her form still technically sound despite the fact that every muscle fiber should have been screaming in protest. 3 recruits fell out during the run. Sarah watched them struggle to keep up, saw the exact moment when their determination finally cracked, and observed them walk slowly toward the instructor's vehicle that would take them to the bell. She felt sympathy for them, but it was the distant sympathy of someone watching a movie. Their failure was tragic, but it wasn't her failure. The run was followed by surf torture that seemed to last forever. The Pacific Ocean had become a personal enemy over the past week, and it welcomed them back with waves that felt like icy hammers. Sarah linked arms with her remaining teammates and sat in the frigid water, letting wave after wave crash over them while instructors offered escape. Hot coffee, warm clothes, a real bed. All you have to do is quit. The temptation was real, so real that Sarah could taste the coffee and feel the warmth of clean blankets. But she had learned to let temptation flow through her like water through a sieve. It was there, acknowledged, and then dismissed. Her tattoo seemed to burn against her shoulder like a reminder of who she was and why she was here. 2 more recruits broke during surf torture, leaving 19 still in the fight. The afternoon brought what Senior Chief Kowalski called fun and games, which was military speak for creative torture designed to test the limits of human endurance. Sarah's team was required to carry their boat over a series of increasingly difficult obstacles while blindfolded. They had to trust each other completely, communicating through touch and whispered words while navigating terrain that would have been challenging under the best circumstances. It was during this evolution that Sarah first noticed something strange happening to the way her team was functioning. They weren't just working together anymore. They were operating as a single organism. She could anticipate Jake Patterson's movements before he made them. She knew when the recruit behind her was about to stumble before he knew it himself. This wasn't just teamwork. This was something deeper, a kind of battlefield telepathy that developed between people who had shared extreme stress. Sarah had experienced glimpses of it in Afghanistan, but never to this degree. It was as if the prolonged suffering had burned away everything superficial, leaving only the essential connections between human beings. Commander Torres appeared during the afternoon training, and Sarah felt her presence like an electric current. The commander moved through the training area with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in her own skin, observing everything and making notes on a tablet computer. When their eyes met across the training ground, Sarah felt that same sense of being evaluated for something beyond normal SEAL qualifications. The commander nodded slightly, just enough to be noticeable, and Sarah felt a surge of energy that carried her through the next hour of punishment. As the sun began to set over the Pacific, the remaining recruits were gathered for the final evolution. They stood in formation on the beach, 19 scarecrows in tattered uniforms, while the instructors prepared to deliver whatever last torture they had devised. The final evolution, Senior Chief Kowalski announced, is called Around the World. You will paddle your boats to San Clemente Island, conduct a simulated reconnaissance mission, and return to the beach. Estimated duration, 12 hours. Failure to complete the mission within the time limit results in automatic dismissal from the program. Sarah felt her teammates shift nervously around her. San Clemente Island was 22 miles offshore, and they would be making the journey in small boats through open ocean. After 5 days of continuous stress, it seemed impossible. But as Sarah looked out at the darkening Pacific, she realized that impossible was just another word. Everything they had done this week had seemed impossible at the beginning. The ocean was just water. The distance was just miles. The mission was just another task to be completed, one stroke at a time. The boats launched just as the last light faded from the western horizon. Sarah's team settled into a paddling rhythm that was slow but sustainable, conserving energy for the long journey ahead. Around them, other boats spread out across the water like a small invasion fleet. The first hours passed in a meditation of movement. Stroke after stroke, mile after mile, the boats crept across the dark ocean under a canopy of stars. Sarah let her mind drift while her body maintained its mechanical rhythm. This was what she had trained for without knowing it. This ability to continue functioning when functioning should have been impossible. But the ocean had other plans. As they approached the halfway point, the weather began to deteriorate. What had started as calm seas became increasingly rough, with swells that made the small boats pitch and roll like carnival rides. Several times, Sarah's boat nearly capsized, saved only by the quick reactions of teammates who seemed to move without thinking. It was during one of these near disasters that Sarah witnessed something that would stay with her forever. Jake Patterson, who had been struggling all week just to keep up, suddenly became the strongest member of their crew. As their boat flipped in a particularly large wave, Jake somehow managed to ride it single-handedly while keeping the rest of the team from being swept away. Where did that come from? Sarah gasped as they climbed back into the boat. I don't know, Jake replied, and he looked as surprised as she felt. I just couldn't let us fail. Not this close to the end. That was when Sarah understood what Hell Week really was. It wasn't about physical conditioning or mental toughness, though those were important. It was about discovering resources within yourself that you never knew existed. It was about finding out that human beings were capable of far more than they imagined, but only when they were pushed past every limit they thought they had. The reconnaissance mission on San Clemente Island was conducted in complete darkness using only hand signals and whispered communications. Sarah's team had to navigate inland, locate a specific target, and gather intelligence without being detected by instructors playing the role of enemy forces. Moving through the rough terrain with no sleep for 5 days should have been impossible. But Sarah found herself operating at a level of awareness she had never experienced before. Every sense was hyperacute. She could hear footsteps from hundreds of yards away, smell the difference between native vegetation and areas where humans had recently passed, navigate by starlight with the precision of a GPS system. When they located their target, a small building marked with infrared reflectors, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion. They had crossed 22 miles of open ocean in small boats, conducted a covert mission on hostile territory, and done it all while functioning on no sleep and minimal food for nearly a week. The return journey was a nightmare of cold water, equipment failures, and recruits who were operating on fumes from empty tanks. 2 boats developed problems that forced their crews to be picked up by safety vessels, eliminating 6 more recruits from the program. Sarah's boat pressed on through increasingly rough seas, driven by a determination that had moved beyond conscious thought into pure instinct. Dawn was breaking over the Pacific when they finally reached the beach where Hell Week had started a lifetime ago. Sarah stumbled out of the boat and fell to her knees in the surf, not from exhaustion but from overwhelming emotion. She had done it. Against all odds, despite every reason to quit, she had made it through the crucible. 13 recruits remained standing on the beach as the sun rose on their last day of Hell Week. 13 out of the original 112. They looked at each other with eyes that held depths they hadn't possessed a week earlier, and Sarah knew that they were bonded now in ways that civilians could never understand. Senior Chief Kowalski approached them with something that might have been pride on his weathered face. Congratulations. You are no longer recruits. You are candidates for Naval Special Warfare. You have proven that you have what it takes to continue this journey. The medical checks that followed were thorough and somewhat alarming. Sarah had lost 18 pounds in 6 days, and her body showed signs of stress that would have hospitalized a normal person. But she was still functional, still capable, still ready for whatever came next. It was during the medical evaluation that Commander Torres appeared at her side. Walk with me, the commander said quietly. They moved away from the others toward the same quiet section of the base where they had talked weeks earlier. Sarah's legs felt unsteady after the boat journey, but her mind was clear and focused. How do you feel? Commander Torres asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. How did she feel? Exhausted beyond description, pushed past every limit she thought she had, changed on a fundamental level that she was only beginning to understand. Like I've been taken apart and put back together, she said finally. Commander Torres nodded approvingly. That's exactly what happened. Hell Week isn't just about testing what you can endure. It's about showing you what you can become when everything you think you know about yourself is stripped away. They walked in silence for several minutes before the commander spoke again. Your performance this week was exceptional, not just physically, but in ways that most people wouldn't notice. Ma'am, leadership under extreme stress. The ability to function when functioning should be impossible. Most importantly, the capacity to help others exceed their own limitations. Commander Torres stopped walking and turned to face Sarah directly. These are rare qualities. Qualities that certain types of missions require. Sarah felt the weight of implication in those words. What kind of missions? The kind that don't officially exist. The kind that require operators who can go places and do things that traditional special operations forces can't accomplish. Commander Torres's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. How would you feel about continuing your training in a program that isn't in any manual? Sarah's heart began to race despite her exhaustion. This was what she had been preparing for, what the tattoo on her shoulder had marked her for years ago. I'd feel honored, ma'am. Commander Torres smiled, and, for the first time since Sarah had known her, it was a smile of genuine warmth. Good. Because tomorrow, your real education begins. As they walked back toward the medical area, Sarah realized that Hell Week hadn't been an ending. It had been a beginning. She had proven herself worthy of something bigger than she had ever imagined, something that would require everything she had learned and more. The 13 survivors of Hell Week were gathered for a final ceremony as the sun climbed higher over the Pacific. They stood in formation on the beach where they had started their journey, no longer the uncertain recruits who had arrived weeks earlier. Sarah looked around at her fellow survivors and felt a fierce pride in what they had accomplished together. Jake Patterson stood straighter than he had in days, his face gaunt, but his eyes bright with achievement. The others bore the same marks of transformation, the same inner light that came from discovering capabilities they never knew they possessed. But even as she celebrated this victory, Sarah's mind was already moving forward to whatever challenges awaited. She had proven herself in the crucible of Hell Week, but Commander Torres had made it clear that this was just the first step on a longer journey. As the ceremony concluded and the survivors dispersed to begin the next phase of their training, Sarah touched the tattoo on her shoulder one more time. It had brought her to this moment, had marked her for a destiny she was only beginning to understand. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests, new opportunities to discover what she was truly capable of. But tonight, for just a few hours, she would rest in the knowledge that she had survived the ultimate test of human endurance and emerged stronger than she had ever imagined possible. The real question now was, what came next? 6 months had passed since Hell Week, and Sarah Mitchell barely recognized the person she had been before entering the Naval Special Warfare Training Center. The remaining phases of SEAL training had pushed her in ways that were different from, but equally demanding, as that legendary week of torture. She had learned to think like a warrior, to operate in the shadows, and to trust teammates with her life in ways that civilians could never understand. Of the 13 survivors from Hell Week, 11 had made it through the complete program. Sarah stood with her class on the beach where their journey had begun, wearing the Navy SEAL trident on her uniform for the first time. The small metal pin felt heavier than it should have, weighted with the knowledge of what it had cost to earn it. Jake Patterson stood beside her in formation, 30 pounds heavier than he had been during Hell Week, but carrying himself with the quiet confidence that marked all graduates of the program. They had become more than teammates during their shared ordeal. They were now part of an extended family that transcended normal relationships. Congratulations, Senior Chief Kowalski said as he moved down the line, shaking hands with each new SEAL. When he reached Sarah, he paused for a moment longer than with the others. You've proven something important here, Mitchell. Don't let anyone tell you different. Sarah nodded, understanding the weight behind his words. She had been the only woman in her class, and her success would open doors for others who followed. But, more than that, she had proven to herself that she was capable of achieving anything she set her mind to, regardless of what others might think was possible. The graduation ceremony was small and private, attended only by instructors, immediate family, and a handful of distinguished guests. Sarah's parents had flown in from Ohio, their faces showing a mixture of pride and barely concealed worry about their daughter's chosen profession. But it was Commander Torres's presence that held Sarah's attention. The commander stood apart from the other observers, watching the proceedings with the same intense focus that Sarah had learned to associate with her. When their eyes met across the crowd, Commander Torres gave her a slight nod that somehow conveyed more meaning than all the congratulations and formal speeches combined. After the ceremony concluded and families dispersed, Sarah found herself alone on the beach where she had spent so many brutal hours. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, no longer the enemy it had seemed during training, but not quite a friend either. It was simply part of the landscape of her new life, a reminder of the challenges she had overcome and those that lay ahead. Taking a moment to reflect, Commander Torres's voice came from behind her. Sarah turned to find the commander approaching across the sand, her dress blue uniform immaculate despite the beach setting. Yes, ma'am. It's hard to believe it's really over. It's not over, Commander Torres said quietly. It's just beginning. Walk with me. They moved away from the graduation area toward the same secluded section of the base, where they had held their previous conversations. Sarah felt the familiar flutter of nervous anticipation that came when she was about to learn something important. "Your orders came through this morning," Commander Torres said without preamble. "Officially, you're being assigned to SEAL Team 7 in Coronado. You'll complete your team integration training and begin the normal rotation of deployments and exercises." Sarah waited for the "but" that she could hear in the commander's tone. "But there's another option," Commander Torres continued. "A program that doesn't appear on any organizational chart. A mission set that requires capabilities that don't officially exist." They had reached a small observation deck that overlooked the ocean. Commander Torres leaned against the railing and looked out at the water, choosing her words carefully. "What do you know about unconventional warfare?" she asked. "The basics from our training. Operations designed to overthrow or disrupt enemy governments through support of resistance movements. That's the textbook definition. But the reality is more complex." Commander Torres turned to face Sarah directly. "Modern conflicts aren't fought between uniformed armies on clearly defined battlefields. They're fought in cities, in refugee camps, in places where traditional military forces can't operate effectively." Sarah nodded, remembering her own experience with the female engagement teams in Afghanistan. Those missions had required capabilities that conventional forces simply didn't possess. "The program I'm offering you access to," Commander Torres continued, "is designed to fill that gap. Small teams of highly specialized operators who can go places and do things that larger units can't accomplish." "What kind of places?" "Anywhere that requires blending into local populations. Anywhere that traditional special operations forces would stand out like neon signs." Commander Torres paused for emphasis. "Places that require female operators." Sarah felt a chill of recognition. This was what the tattoo on her shoulder had marked her for, what her classified assignments in Afghanistan had been preparing her for. "How long has this program existed?" 5 years in development, 2 years in limited operation. You would be part of the 3rd operational class." Commander Torres pulled out a tablet computer and handed it to Sarah. "These are some of the mission profiles we've completed." Sarah scrolled through the files with growing amazement. Reconnaissance missions in countries where American forces weren't officially present. Hostage rescues from locations that conventional teams couldn't approach. Counterterrorism operations that required operators who could disappear into civilian populations. "This is incredible," she said softly. "Why haven't I heard about any of this?" "Because it's designed to be invisible. Official military doctrine still assumes that special operations are primarily a male profession. This program works around those assumptions." Commander Torres retrieved the tablet and secured it in her uniform pocket. "The question is, are you interested?" Sarah looked out at the ocean, her mind racing with the implications of what she was being offered. Everything she had worked for, everything she had suffered through, had been leading to this moment. A chance to be part of something truly revolutionary, something that could change the nature of how wars were fought. "What would it mean for my official assignment?" "You would maintain your cover assignment with SEAL Team 7. Most people would never know you were part of anything else. But, when called upon, you would deploy with your special unit on missions that require your unique capabilities." "How often?" "As often as the mission demands. Could be months between deployments, could be back-to-back operations. The nature of our work is unpredictable." Sarah thought about Jake Patterson and the others from her class who would be starting their conventional SEAL careers. They would deploy with their teams, conduct official operations, and build careers within the established military structure. It sounded appealing in its straightforwardness. But it also sounded limiting. What kind of training would be involved? Commander Torres smiled at the question. "Everything you never learned in conventional SEAL training. Languages, cultural integration, advanced psychological operations, cover identity development. You would become more than just a warrior. You would become a chameleon." "How many people know about this program?" "At the highest levels? Maybe 24 people in the entire government." "At the operational level?" "The operators themselves, their immediate handlers, and support staff who are compartmentalized and don't see the big picture." Sarah understood the implications. This wasn't just a career choice. It was a decision to step into the shadows of American military operations, to become part of a world that existed in the spaces between official policies and public awareness. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Of course. But not for long. The next training cycle begins in 2 weeks, and there are only a limited number of spots available." Commander Torres handed her a small card with nothing but a phone number written on it. "Call that number when you've made your decision. You have 72 hours. They walked back toward the graduation area, in comfortable silence. Sarah's mind was spinning with questions and possibilities, but underneath the uncertainty was a growing sense of excitement. This was what she had been unconsciously preparing for her entire life. The next 3 days were among the longest of Sarah's life. She reported to SEAL Team 7 and began the integration process, meeting her new teammates and learning about the unit's mission and procedures. On the surface, it was everything she had worked toward. These were elite warriors, men who had proven themselves in combat, and who welcomed her into their brotherhood with genuine respect. But every conversation felt somehow incomplete. Every briefing about conventional operations seemed limited compared to the possibilities Commander Torres had described. Sarah found